There are old photos that look strangely ordinary. A smile, a pose, a soft light falling on a face. But sometimes behind that peaceful look is a secret that will be heard again a century later. That 1886 wedding photo once made many people believe they were seeing happiness. A radiant bride, a gentle groom, a moment that seemed eternal. But when that photo was found in an attic in Colorado, historians began to realize that smile was not necessarily that of a living person. From faded lines on yellowed paper to forgotten church records, the story gradually emerged of a wedding that took place in the last breath and a vow not to succumb to death. Tonight, let's listen with sleepy history tales very quietly to find out what happened in the photo that seemed like just a happy moment. This 1886 wedding portrait appears joyful at first glance until historians uncovered the secret hidden behind the bride's smile. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her glasses as the morning light filtered through the Smithsonian's photo archive. Before her sat a newly arrived daguerreotype, a wedding portrait from 1886. The bride stood radiant in a layered white gown, her eyes bright with apparent joy beside a neatly dressed groom in front of a small wooden church. It looked like pure happiness. One perfect moment frozen in silver back when photography itself was still a rare luxury of the American frontier. Another estate donation, her assistant murmured, setting down the paperwork with a quiet thud. It had been found in an attic in Colorado Springs, its family believing it might hold historical value because of its remarkable preservation. Sarah leaned closer. Her trained eyes caught something that most people would overlook. The bride's smile was bright, but her body, rigid, unnaturally stiff, seemed to betray a quiet struggle to remain upright. The groom's hand rested protectively at her waist, yet his face carried a tension that didn't belong in a celebration of love. The clarity of the image was extraordinary for its time. Every detail stood out: the delicate lace, the faint pin marks along the seams of her gown, evidence of last-minute alterations. The bouquet she held, though beautiful, showed unmistakable signs of wilting. That struck Sarah as odd. In a carefully planned wedding portrait, why would the flowers already be dying? There's something different about this one, she whispered to herself, lifting her magnifying glass. Through the lens, she noticed the bride's hands unnaturally pale, with the faintest tremor visible, even in the stillness of 19th century photography. It was subtle, but real. A moment of life, or perhaps something else, trapped in the silver plate forever. The longer she stared, the more questions surfaced. What was this photograph truly capturing beneath its polished illusion of happiness? Why did it feel less like a celebration and more like a quiet plea, frozen in time? Unable to let go of the unease stirring in her chest, Sarah began to investigate the photograph's history. The estate documents offered little help. It had been discovered among the belongings of the late Margaret Thompson, carefully wrapped in yellowed silk and stored inside a cedar box crafted, it seemed, solely to protect this single image from the wear of time. No names, no notes. Only this haunting fragment from 1886 that seemed to whisper of something left unfinished. That silence only deepened Sarah's curiosity. Why had someone preserved this one picture with such reverence? She reached out to Helen Rodriguez, the executor of Margaret Thompson's estate. Helen sounded tired, yet intrigued. The house was full of antiques, she said over the phone. My aunt collected everything, but that photograph, it was kept separate, like it was sacred. She never let anyone touch it. Helen explained that the house itself had been purchased in 1923 from another family, meaning the portrait was much older than Margaret's ownership. Sarah asked her to search again. Letters, journals, anything that might reveal the story behind the image. In the meantime, she turned her professional attention to the photograph's details, its composition, the light, the technical fingerprints of the photographer's hand. Every mark could hold a clue. Have you ever wondered how much a single photograph can hide? Can joy, when fixed in silver, conceal something far more chilling beneath its shine? Stay with me, because this story and the secret it carries is only beginning to unfold. The embossed studio marking on the back read Morrison & Sons Photography, Denver Territory. The lettering was elegant, curling like smoke, perfectly in keeping with the style of the late 19th century. Sarah typed the name into her department's archival database. The Morrison studio, as it turned out, had only operated between 1885 and 1889, a narrow window that confirmed the date of the image, but raised a troubling question. Why would a photography studio successful enough to produce such a masterful portrait vanish after only 4 years? Unfortunately, the business records from that unsettled period were incomplete pages. Missing names lost to time, making it nearly impossible to trace individual clients or portrait sessions. 3 days later, Sarah's phone rang. It was Helen Rodriguez, and there was an urgency in her tone that made Sarah sit up straight. Sarah, Helen began, her voice trembling with excitement. I found something hidden. While cleaning out her great-aunt's ornate Victorian desk, Helen had discovered a concealed compartment so cleverly built into the woodwork that even the estate appraisers had missed it. Inside was a small leather-bound journal, tied with a faded ribbon, and several loose papers yellowed with age. There's a letter here dated 1924, Helen said, breathlessly. It mentions the wedding photograph, and what it says is, well, it's disturbing. I think you need to see this right away. Within hours, the documents had been professionally photographed and sent to Sarah's inbox. That afternoon, under the sterile glow of her office light, she opened the files. The letter appeared in elegant copperplate handwriting, the refined penmanship of a woman educated in the late Victorian age. It was signed simply Martha. No last name. And then Sarah read the passage that made her heart stop. The young woman in the photograph was dying even as she posed for it. Her family wanted to remember her as she had been, radiant, happy, whole. They knew she would not see another sunrise. Sarah stared at the words, the chill creeping up her arms. The letter went on to describe how the bride had been ravaged by consumption tuberculosis, its grip so severe that even standing upright for the photograph had caused her agony. Suddenly, the pieces aligned: the pallor of the skin, the rigid posture, the wilting flowers, the groom's anxious expression. They weren't quirks of composition, they were traces of suffering. Sarah sat in silence. The hum of the archive's climate control, faint in the background. She thought of the fragile young woman, forced to smile for what she knew would be her final portrait. In Martha's accompanying journal, the tone shifted from grief to obsession. She had devoted years of her life trying to uncover the bride's true identity. Her entries were meticulous dates, correspondence church records, even burial listings from parishes across Colorado. She had written of her need to honor the girl's courage, lest her name vanish with the dust. Using Martha's notes as a guide, Sarah began her own investigation, this time armed with the tools of the modern age. She combed through newly digitized death records and medical ledgers from 1886, focusing on tuberculosis treatment facilities across the Denver territory. Most of the records were fragmented, barely legible, but Sarah pressed on. And then one evening, under the cool white light of her digital workstation, she made a discovery that Martha never could have. Using high-resolution imaging and enhanced LED analysis, she noticed something so faint, it was nearly invisible. Tiny embroidered initials on the bride's gown sleeve. Silk thread faded nearly to nothing. But the letters were there, ER. Her heart pounded. Martha had missed them entirely. With this new clue, Sarah narrowed her search women with names beginning in E. Elizabeth Emma, Eleanor Emily, who had died in late 1886 across Colorado. She expanded her investigation beyond Denver to nearby towns and rural settlements, reasoning that a family facing the stigma of tuberculosis might have sought privacy in the countryside. And then finally, a response. An email from the Littleton Historical Society appeared in her inbox. The subject line read, Ray, 1886, wedding photograph. Possible match found. Sarah's breath caught as she opened it, feeling the same quiet tension that had haunted every person who had ever looked at that photograph. Who was the bride, known only as ER? And what truth had been hidden in her fading smile for more than a century? The answer, it seemed, was waiting in Littleton. The records from the Littleton Historical Society offered a name, and with it, the beginning of an ending. A carefully typed note from the Society's librarian, Mr. James Patterson, explained that their archives mentioned a young woman named Elizabeth Rose, who had tragically died on her wedding day in November of 1886. But much of the original documentation had perished decades later in a fire that tore through the archive building during the 1920s. Still, Patterson promised to search the surviving fragments, old newspaper clippings, parish bulletins, and brittle registry pages scorched by time. If there's anything left of her story, he wrote, we'll find it. While waiting, Sarah reached out to medical historians who specialized in 19th century tuberculosis, desperate to understand how Elizabeth could have looked so alive even as she was dying. Dr. Robert Chen from the University of Colorado explained a cruel paradox known among physicians of the era, a rally, a brief, deceptive burst of energy that often preceded death. Patients would seem almost miraculously better, he told her over the phone sometimes, even strong enough to stand, smile, or dance. It was the illness's final illusion. That one phrase lingered in Sarah's mind. The final illusion. Days later, an email arrived from Mr. Patterson. The subject line read simply, "Found something." He had located a half-burned page of the Littleton Weekly Chronicle from November 1886. On it was a short, stark social notice. The wedding of Miss Elizabeth Rose to Mr. Thomas William was celebrated yesterday at St. Mary's Chapel outside Littleton. The bride, daughter of respected merchant William Rose, wore her grandmother's silk gown, specially altered for the solemn occasion. That was it. No mention of celebration, no reception, no honeymoon. Just formality, restraint, silence. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she cross-referenced the Denver County morgue records. They typed in fading ink, she found the name again, Elizabeth Rose William. Deceased, November 15, 1886. Cause of death, pulmonary consumption, advanced stage. The same day the wedding announcement appeared in print. Her suspicions crystallized into heartbreaking clarity. Elizabeth had not married before her decline. She had married during it. The photograph wasn't a joyful wedding memento. It was a record of farewell. A deathbed ceremony frozen in silver and light. The wilting flowers, the pale skin, the tense smile, all of it made sense now. Desperate for confirmation, Sarah contacted St. Mary's Chapel. The current pastor, Father Miguel Santos, sounded both surprised and moved by her inquiry. Our original chapel burned in 1932, he explained, but some of our old registers survived. I'll check personally. A week later, he called back. His voice was quiet, reverent. There are 2 entries for Elizabeth Rose, both dated November 15th, 1886. He paused, letting the weight of it settle. One in the marriage register at 2 p.m. and another in the burial register at 8 p.m. that same evening. Sarah's breath caught as he continued. And there's a note written in pencil between the lines. It says, she lived just long enough to become his wife. Silence filled the space between them, thick, tender, inescapable. Every mystery in the photograph now spoke with heartbreaking logic. The rigid posture, the wilted bouquet, the groom's trembling hand. It was the portrait of love itself, captured at the very edge of life. Determined to honor that love, Sarah turned her search toward the living. Through genealogical societies and digital ancestry records, she traced the name Thomas William through generations of census entries and family trees. In the 1889 census, she found a record: Thomas William remarried to a woman named Catherine. The couple remained in Colorado, their descendants weaving quietly into the state's history. And then, another spark of connection. A name that caught her attention, Patricia William Davis, listed as a great-granddaughter and notably an active member of Denver's Historical Preservation Society. When Sarah called her, the elderly woman was cautious at first. I've heard many people claim to have found something about our family, she said gently. But when Sarah emailed her the enhanced image and the scanned church documents, the phone line fell silent for a long moment. Then Patricia whispered through tears, I've heard this story my entire life. My great-grandfather Thomas never stopped talking about her. He said Elizabeth was the bravest soul he'd ever known. Even as she was dying, she wanted to wear white, to stand to smile, to say her vows properly. She wanted to look like a bride, not a patient. Sarah could almost see it, the fragile figure in silk standing beneath the chapel's wooden beams. Sunlight filtering through her breath, shallow but steady. Patricia revealed that Thomas himself had arranged for the Morrison photographer to capture their wedding. It was Elizabeth's wish, she said softly. She didn't want him to remember her as sick. She wanted him to remember love. A few days later, Sarah visited Patricia's Denver home. Inside a cedar box lined with worn velvet, she saw what remained of that day, a faded silk ribbon from the bouquet, a lock of pale hair, and one fragile letter dated November 14th, 1886, written in delicate handwriting. As Sarah unfolded the paper, She could almost hear Elizabeth's faint voice whispering across the years, "Tomorrow I will marry the man I love. Even if I do not live to see the morning, I will meet him as a bride. And that, I think, will be enough." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the quiet ache of the century between them. A single photograph once thought to capture joy had revealed something infinitely deeper. A love that refused to surrender even to death itself. And as she turned the daguerreotype under the soft museum light, the bride's faint smile seemed to shift, no longer mysterious, but peaceful. A promise fulfilled. A goodbye frozen forever in silver. Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt it watching you back, as if it remembers something the world has forgotten? Perhaps some images are not meant to capture life, but the moment love refuses to let it go. The letter, addressed simply to my dearest Thomas, carried a serenity that seemed impossible for someone so close to death. In that fragile handwriting, Elizabeth confessed what both of them already knew, that her time was nearly gone. "I know tomorrow will be my last day on this earth," she wrote with unshakable calm. "But I want to spend every precious moment of it as your wife, not as your dying friend. Please don't remember me as the sick girl you tried to save. Remember me as the woman who loved you enough to marry you with her final breath." Patricia's voice trembles as she reads those words aloud to Sarah, the weight of a century pressing down between them. She explains that Thomas never spoke publicly of Elizabeth's passing on their wedding day. In the small Denver community where they lived, he simply said she had died soon after the ceremony. A half-truth that shielded her from gossip and preserved the quiet dignity of their love. Family stories filled in what the records could not. Elizabeth had insisted on standing for the photograph, though every breath came like fire. Her father and Thomas supported her from either side, hiding their effort behind solemn composure. The photographer, Mr. Morrison, worked quickly, his lens trembling slightly as he captured what would be her final image. Patricia smiles faintly through tears. "My great-grandfather said that photograph showed her truest self," she whispers. "Not a victim, but a woman who chose love over despair." Through Patricia's stories and the letters carefully kept across 4 generations, Sarah reconstructs Elizabeth Rose's last day, hour by fragile hour. That morning, November 15th, 1886, Elizabeth woke barely able to speak above a whisper. Her chest rattled with each shallow breath, yet when Thomas arrived, she smiled. Somehow she still had enough strength to say what she had been holding inside for days, that she wanted to marry him today. Her father protested at first. The doctor had warned that any exertion could end her life. But Elizabeth, thin and pale as she was, would not be denied. With the quiet help of her mother and younger sister, she was dressed in her grandmother's wedding gown, the same one Sarah had noticed in the faded photograph. Hastily pinned, imperfectly fitted, but radiant all the same. The family arranged for Father O'Brien to perform the ceremony at St. Mary's Chapel, a small, unassuming building, chosen for its nearness to their home. Few guests were invited. They all understood what this gathering truly was: a wedding and a farewell. Jonathan Morrison, the photographer, carried his heavy equipment to the chapel at Thomas's pleading request. He was known in Denver for his compassion, a man who had photographed not only weddings and births, but the solemn faces of those taken too soon. But never before had he been asked to capture a moment like this, where love and death stood side by side. Patricia says her family always believed Elizabeth Sculler had returned briefly that morning. One last, deceptive spark of health, what doctors would later call the rally. It was enough to let her stand upright enough to let her say, "I do." The ceremony lasted no more than 10 minutes. Witnesses recalled that her vows were whispered, yet carried with a strength that silenced the entire room. Thomas held her upright through every word, through every tremor of breath. When Morrison raised his camera, she leaned into her husband, the veil slipping slightly, as if caught in a sigh. That single photograph, the one Sarah had discovered so many decades later, became the final record of Elizabeth Rose alive. And though her story faded quietly into local memory, the legend of the bride who would not wait for heaven endured, passed in whispers, remembered in love and rediscovered by those who still look closely enough at the past to feel its heartbeat. The Morrison Photography Studio never sent a bill to the William family. Mr. Morrison considered it an honor, not a service, to capture the image of such quiet courage in the face of death. Later, he would tell his colleagues that photographing Elizabeth's wedding was the most moving experience of his entire career. Father O'Brien too carried the memory of that ceremony through the long cold winter that followed. In his sermons, he spoke often of love's power to overcome fear, though he never once mentioned Elizabeth's name. Those who listened closely, however, could sense that the words came from somewhere deeply personal. Many in his small congregation, struggling through the hardships of frontier life, found strength in those messages of devotion that transcended suffering. Thomas, for his part, kept the enlarged photograph in every home he ever lived in. When he remarried Catherine in 1889, a marriage born of mutual respect and companionship, rather than the consuming passion he had once known, she insisted the portrait remain in its place of honor. Catherine understood something that many never do, that loving the memory of another did not diminish their own bond, but deepened it. She often told her children that Elizabeth had shown her what true love really meant. Love that gives, that endures, that asks for nothing in return. The photograph would pass through many careful hands in the years that followed, each person protecting it, each person quietly aware that it carried something sacred. Eventually it came into the possession of Martha, the very woman who had spent decades obsessed with identifying the mysterious bride. Patricia explains to Sarah that Martha had been Catherine's niece, and suddenly, everything makes sense. Her relentless curiosity, her lifelong need to uncover the truth. Martha had grown up hearing only fragments of the story, hushed mentions of a first wife who had died on her wedding day. But she'd never been told the bride's full name, nor had she seen the photograph until inheriting it from Catherine's estate. As Sarah rereads Martha's old journal, she feels a growing sense of wonder. Those cryptic entries, the frustration, the regret, the final note expressing sorrow at never learning the bride's identity, might have been written not from ignorance, but from purpose. Perhaps Martha had discovered the truth long ago and chose to hide it, waiting for someone who could tell it with care. Someone like Sarah. From Thomas to Catherine, from Martha to Sarah, the photograph had journeyed through time like a fragile flame, passed from one pair of gentle hands to another. Not for fame, not for profit, but for remembrance. 6 months after beginning her investigation, Sarah finally brings Elizabeth's story into the light. At the Smithsonian Institution, she curates a quiet, haunting exhibition titled Love Transcendent Wedding Portraits as Historical Testimony. At its center, Elizabeth's photograph. Not just as a relic of tragedy, but as a symbol of something far greater. Patricia attends the opening night, surrounded by family members who had never known the truth, who had only inherited whispers. They stand together before the portrait, tears softening their smiles as if meeting their ancestor for the first time. Displayed beside it are Elizabeth's letter to Thomas, the fragile church records showing her wedding and funeral on the same day, Martha's journals, and even Dr. Chen's clinical explanation of the rally that allowed Elizabeth those few miraculous hours of strength. His contribution helps visitors grasp what she endured and what extraordinary resolve it took to stand before that camera, smiling as her lungs failed her. The exhibit draws national attention. Genealogical societies cite it as a call to action, urging families everywhere to preserve their old photographs, to search for the stories hidden behind their faded faces. Dozens write to Sarah each letter, sharing discoveries of their own forgotten tragedies, acts of courage, quiet love stories lost to time. In Denver, Father Santos holds a small memorial service at the modern St. Mary's Church, the same parish that once recorded Elizabeth's last moments. Patricia stands at the altar and reads Elizabeth's letter aloud. Her voice trembles, but never breaks. When she finishes, the church falls silent. For a moment, everyone seems to feel her presence there, the young bride who refused to let death steal her wedding day. The photograph now rests permanently within the Smithsonian's collection. A simple bronze plaque beneath it reads, Elizabeth Rose, William, 1865-1886, married, November 15th, 1886, died, November 15th, 1886. Her radiant smile in this portrait represents the eternal triumph of love over mortality. What was once mistaken for an ordinary wedding photograph now stands as one of the museum's most powerful testaments to devotion, a reminder that even in the briefest of lives, love can leave an echo that never fades.